The scent of hay and sawdust drifted heavy in the air, clinging to every inch of the wooden auction barn. A dozen men leaned against the rails, cowboy hats tilted low, eyes scanning the pen as a chestnut mare was guided into the center. Her name was Sierra, and there was something about her that made people stop talking. Her left front leg was wrapped in a bright red bandage. Not bold enough to shout, but loud enough to whisper danger. At the auctioneer's stand stood Caleb Montoya, a seasoned man in his late 50s with weathered skin and a firm jaw hidden under graying stubble. His tan hat was pulled down low, and his plaid shirt matched the serious look in his eyes. He cleared his throat and leaned toward the microphone, steadying his hand on the worn wood of the podium. Caleb had worked auctions for over 2 decades, and he knew how to control a room. But tonight wasn't like any other night. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice thick with confidence. "What you see here is Sierra. 4 years old, powerful lineage, broke and trained with care. This is a mare for someone serious." He paused for effect. But beneath his confident tone, Caleb was hiding more than nerves. That red wrap was a problem, and he knew it. He had paid a vet to take care of the paperwork, and now he was gambling his reputation that no one would notice. Among the crowd stood Elijah Veyrón, a young man with sharp features and eyes that didn't blink. No one in the barn recognized him, but there was something in his presence, steady, watchful, quiet. He leaned against the rail, arms crossed, gaze fixed on Sierra. It wasn't the look of a buyer. It was deeper, like he knew her, like he was looking for something beyond the surface. "Elijah," someone muttered nearby. "Ain't he one of the Carraldes boys?" The name struck something in Sofia Ardanza, who stood quietly near the back. Her hands trembled slightly as she whispered to her niece, Marisol Tenoya, who'd come along just for company. "That horse. I've seen her before. But not here." Then it happened. Elijah raised one hand. 2,500, he said, voice calm but firm. The room quieted instantly. Caleb's eyes darted toward him. Something about that bid felt too precise, too intentional. And as Sierra shifted her weight, favoring her left leg again, Caleb's chest tightened. The past was circling, and this time it had a name. Caleb Montoya gripped the podium tighter than he intended. His knuckles turned pale under the pressure, the echo of Elijah Veyrón's voice still hanging in the air like dust after a stampede. 2,500, he repeated, trying to steady his breath. The number wasn't the issue. It was the man behind it. Elijah looked too familiar, and too calm. Caleb scanned the faces around the pen. Everyone else was silent, watching him now, not the horse. Sierra shifted again, her leg trembling just slightly, enough to betray what the wrap tried to hide. "Do I hear 3,000? Caleb asked, voice forced, almost hoarse. But no one responded. Not even the regulars who used to bid just to push the price higher. Their eyes kept darting between Sierra's leg and Elijah's face. And Sofia Ardanza, standing near the back, whispered again to her niece, Marisol Tenoya, "I swear on your abuela's name. That horse belonged to the Carraldes ranch. That's Mateo's horse." Marisol frowned, unsure. Mateo Carraldes? The name hadn't been spoken out loud in years. It stirred something in Sofia's chest, like a door creaking open inside a long-abandoned house. Mateo had vanished after the fire. Everyone assumed he'd lost everything, including Sierra. But if this really was the same horse, what was she doing here? And why was Caleb Montoya trying to sell her off like just another number on the auction sheet? Elijah didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on Sierra, the corners of his mouth twitching just slightly, something between anger and heartbreak. Caleb's mind was racing. He recognized that face now. Elijah was Mateo's boy. He'd seen him once, as a kid, standing barefoot by the fence line, watching the horses run like it was church. Now he was grown, and standing in front of Caleb like a ghost come to collect. Caleb cleared his throat again. Going once, going twice. He lifted the gavel, but his hand stopped in midair. The silence was too heavy now. Even Sierra lowered her head as if she sensed what was at stake. Caleb's past was no longer buried. It was standing 10 feet in front of him, bidding on the one thing that could bring it all crashing down. Before he could finish the call, a second hand shot up from the side of the barn. A voice rang out, sharp, unexpected. 3,000. Everyone turned. It was Joshua Durellos, a rival breeder and longtime critic of Caleb. But there was something in his smirk that said this wasn't about horses anymore. It was personal. The barn fell into a strange silence, the kind that presses into your chest and makes the air feel heavier. Joshua Durellos had just raised the stakes, not with his bid, but with his smile. Caleb Montoya saw it for what it was, a challenge. Not for Sierra, not even for the money, but for control, for reputation. Joshua had been circling like a buzzard ever since Caleb started selling horses again after his short break. Everyone in town knew that wasn't a real vacation. It was fallout from something he'd kept buried for years. Elijah Veyrón didn't flinch. His eyes flicked over to Joshua, and for a moment their stares met, two very different kinds of men drawn into the same storm. Elijah raised his hand again. 3,500. He didn't raise his voice, didn't show emotion. But the barn felt colder after he spoke. Sierra twitched her ears. Something in her recognized the tone. Or maybe the name. Elijah wasn't bidding for pride. He was bidding for justice, maybe even redemption. In the back of the barn, Sofia Ardanza gripped the edge of the rail. "This ain't right," she muttered to Marisol Tenoya, who stood beside her, visibly shaken now. "That mare shouldn't be here. And Caleb damn well knows it." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from memory. Years ago, she had been close to Mateo Carraldes. Close enough to know what Sierra meant to him. More than a horse. She was the last thing he saved from the flames. The fire that burned the ranch to the ground. The fire no one ever investigated. 4,000, Joshua shot back without hesitation. His eyes never left Caleb. Marisol looked at her aunt, confused. Why is he doing this? He doesn't even like mares. Sofia nodded slowly. Because if Elijah gets that horse, people are gonna start asking questions Caleb can't afford to answer. Caleb's jaw tightened. Sweat gathered under his collar. This was spiraling fast. He thought he could slip Sierra through, quiet and clean. A favor repaid with silence. But now the past was being auctioned off in front of half the town. And the looks he was getting, especially from Sofia, told him the old stories were about to surface. His grip on the gavel loosened. His throat was dry. Before he could speak, Isabella Lascora, the town's reporter, stepped through the side door with a notepad in hand. "Am I late?" she asked casually. But her eyes scanned the scene like a hawk. She'd written about the Carraldes fire years ago, and she never believed it was just an accident. Caleb froze. What started as a sale had just turned into a reckoning. Caleb Montoya felt like the walls of the barn were closing in. Sweat clung to his brow, but it wasn't from the heat, it was from the weight of a moment he could no longer control. Sierra stood in the center of the ring, head low, leg trembling, eyes filled with something eerily human, grief. Elijah Veyrón's last bid still echoed in Caleb's mind. 3,500. Not for a horse. For the truth. He looked across the barn and caught Isabella Lascora scribbling in her notebook, her eyes darting between the mare, Elijah, and him. That woman never forgot a name, a date, or a buried lie. She'd covered the Carraldes fire a decade ago, back when the ashes were still warm. Back when people whispered Mateo's name like it was cursed. Caleb had always hated reporters, but Isabella had a special way of digging until things bled. Near the back, Sofia Ardanza sat down slowly on the edge of a hay bale. Her knees felt weak. Marisol Tinoya crouched beside her, concern in her eyes. "Tia, are you okay?" Sofia nodded, but her thoughts were far away, burning again in the past. She remembered the night Mateo came to her door, soaked in sweat and smoke, carrying Sierra on a lead rope, limping, scared. "Don't ask," he'd told her. "Just keep her safe." But she couldn't. Not for long. 4,500, Elijah said suddenly, drawing every eye back to the ring. Joshua Durellos narrowed his eyes. 5,000, he snapped back. There was no hesitation now. It was war. But while Joshua bid with ego, Elijah carried something heavier. His jaw was tight, shoulders rigid. He wasn't just trying to win Sierra. He was trying to reclaim something that had been stolen. Caleb slammed the gavel on the wood, harder than necessary. 5,000 from Mr. Durellos, he barked, trying to regain control. "Do I hear more?" But his voice cracked. Something in him knew it didn't matter who won. The damage was already done. Eyes were watching. Stories were forming. And Sierra, poor Sierra, was standing in the center like a piece of evidence no one could deny. In the silence that followed, the barn door creaked open. An old man stepped in, limping slightly, with silver hair and a worn leather hat in his hands. People turned to look, some with confusion, some with recognition. Caleb's heart nearly stopped, because the man walking toward the auction ring, eyes sunken but steady, was Mateo Carraldes. Alive, and ready to speak. The moment Mateo Carraldes stepped fully into the light, the barn changed. The chatter stopped. Boots shifted on the dusty floor. Eyes widened. For 10 years, people had believed he was either dead or lost somewhere far from Texas, broken by the fire that destroyed his ranch. But here he was, thinner, slower, older, but undeniably him. Caleb Montoya's stomach turned to stone. Mateo's eyes scanned the barn until they landed on Sierra. The mare raised her head slowly, ears twitching, then gave a soft, aching whinny. It was the first sound she'd made all night. Elijah Veyrón closed his eyes, jaw clenched, his breath shaky. The horse remembered. The past remembered. And now, everyone else would have to remember too. "I didn't come here to make a scene," Mateo said, his voice quiet but sharp, like a knife dulled by time but still capable of cutting. "I came for my horse." Some gasped. Others looked at Caleb. Joshua Durellos folded his arms smugly, sensing the pressure shifting away from him. Caleb stepped back from the podium, lips tight, heart racing. The one thing he feared more than the secret getting out was Mateo surviving to tell it himself. Sofia Ardanza stood, trembling slightly. Her hand covered her mouth. Marisol Tinoya gripped her aunt's arm. "He's really alive," she whispered. "You knew?" Sofia nodded, tears welling. "He trusted me once. I failed him. But I never stopped praying he'd come back." In the corner, Isabella Lascora's pen moved faster than her thoughts. This wasn't just a headline anymore. This was the story of the decade. "Mr. Carraldes," Caleb finally said, stepping forward, trying to control his voice, "this horse is listed under my registry. Bought legally. I have paperwork." Mateo nodded slowly, almost with pity. "You always had paperwork, Caleb. But you and I both know Sierra was never for sale." He reached into his coat and pulled out an old photo, a younger Mateo standing beside Sierra as a filly, and a teenage Elijah holding her lead. "Some things you don't get to steal." The barn was dead silent. Caleb's lips parted, but no words came. His lies had always survived on silence and absence. But now Mateo was here. And Sierra stood as proof that not everything burns completely. Elijah stepped forward, placing a steadying hand on Sierra's mane. His voice cracked as he spoke. She never forgot him. And neither did I. Caleb Montoya stared at the photo in Mateo Carraldes' hand like it was a weapon. And in a way it was. Not because of what it showed, but because of what it proved. Sierra wasn't just a horse. She was living evidence of a story Caleb had spent a decade burying beneath forged documents, quiet payoffs, and burned bridges. Now the truth stood 3 feet from the auction block, and everyone in that barn could feel it pressing in. "You should have stayed gone," Caleb muttered under his breath, but Isabella Lascora heard it and wrote it down without flinching. Mateo stepped forward, slow and deliberate, his limp more pronounced now. "You think I came here for revenge?" he asked. "No, I came here for her, and for my son." The words landed like thunder. Eyes turned sharply to Elijah Veyrón, whose posture stiffened. It wasn't just a bid anymore, it was blood. Elijah's throat tightened, but he didn't step back. "You left," he said quietly. "You never came for me." Mateo looked down. "I didn't leave by choice, Elijah. I was forced to. And I spent every damn day thinking about what I lost. First your mother, then you." His voice cracked for the first time. "And Sierra. She was all I had left to remind me that I hadn't imagined it all." From the sidelines, Sofia Ardanza could no longer hold her silence. "He tried to get help," she said firmly, stepping forward. "But no one listened. Caleb made sure of that." Her voice carried pain, but also fury. He used the fire as an opportunity to erase Mateo. He knew about the land deal. He knew what Mateo refused to sign. And he punished him for it. All heads turned to Caleb. Joshua Durellos smirked, enjoying every second of the unraveling. Caleb raised both hands slightly. "You're twisting it all. That fire was an accident. You've got no proof otherwise." But as soon as the words left his mouth, Marisol Tenoya pulled out an envelope from her coat. "This was in my grandmother's attic. She kept everything. Inside, maps, land contracts, and a letter from Caleb offering a friendly solution to Mateo, dated 1 week before the fire." The air thickened. Nobody said a word. Even Sierra stood still, as if she too understood the gravity of that letter. Caleb's face went pale, the color draining from his cheeks as every lie began to crumble. And Mateo, voice calm and low, said the words that shook the floor. "You didn't just try to erase me, Caleb. You tried to erase my name. But it's still written, in ash, in scars, and in her eyes." The barn, once filled with the rustle of bidding cards and casual chatter, now sat frozen. Caleb Montoya's world was unraveling with each breath. The letter Marisol Tenoya held shook slightly in her hand, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "My grandmother always said, the truth waits in the dark. But it doesn't die there." Caleb couldn't speak. He didn't have to. The evidence was louder than his denial. Mateo Carraldes kept his eyes on Sierra. He hadn't looked at Caleb since the letter came out. "You took everything," he said, voice tired but firm. "You took my home. You took my future. You turned this entire town against me." His gaze shifted slowly to the crowd. "And none of you asked why. You just assumed I disappeared because I was guilty." Shame swept over the faces of familiar townsfolk, men who once called him brother, women who once waved from porches. Elijah Veyrón had stayed silent, but his fists were clenched at his sides. His voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. "I spent most of my life thinking my father abandoned me." He turned to Mateo. "I didn't need revenge. I just needed to know why." Mateo nodded slowly. "And you deserved that. You deserved so much more than the silence they fed you." In the corner, Sofia Ardanza wiped her eyes. Her memories of Mateo, of nights filled with laughter and dreams, had been buried under years of guilt. Joshua Durellos, arms crossed, leaned against the barn wall, a smirk still lingering on his face, but even he had stopped bidding. The sale was over. Sierra wasn't a product anymore. She was a testimony. Then, slowly, Isabella Lascora stepped into the center of the barn, holding her notepad at her side. "I've written about corruption, land fraud, wildfires, and broken families," she said. "But I never imagined they'd all intersect in this barn." She looked at Caleb. "The people deserve to know, and they will." Caleb's eyes flicked toward the exit, but it was too late. No one was going to forget what happened here tonight. Sierra let out a soft snort, breaking the silence. She stepped forward and gently nudged Elijah's arm, recognizing his scent, his energy. He turned, his eyes glassy. "She remembers," he said. "All of it." And in that moment, surrounded by a crowd that had once turned its back on the truth, Mateo and Elijah stood side by side, not as strangers, but as father and son, reclaiming everything they were told they lost. Mateo Carraldes stood quietly in the middle of the barn, the air still thick with tension. He had spoken his truth, but what lingered now wasn't anger. It was something deeper, the ache of all the years stolen. Elijah Veyrón hadn't moved from his side, and though neither of them spoke, the silence between them was heavier than words. The crowd kept their distance, unsure if they were witnessing a reunion or the final collapse of a broken family. Caleb Montoya hadn't left the podium. His hands gripped the edge so hard his knuckles went white. He could feel the judgment in every eye, but worse than that was the lack of denial. No one was coming to his defense. Even his longtime ally, Joshua Durellos, had gone quiet. That was the problem with lies. They worked until the silence was broken. And Mateo had shattered it with nothing more than the truth. Across the barn, Sofia Ardanza stepped forward, slowly, as if afraid the moment might break. Her voice was soft. "You should have told us," she said to Mateo. "I would have believed you." Mateo turned, his face showing the weight of regret. "I tried, Sophie. But some people didn't want the truth. And others were paid not to hear it." Her lips trembled. She had always wondered. Now she knew. Marisol Tenoya placed the envelope of documents on a nearby table. "This doesn't just affect you," she said, directing her words toward Caleb. "That land you tried to steal, my family's farm borders it. You were going to take that too, little by little." Her voice was stronger now. She wasn't just the niece anymore. She was part of a generation tired of inherited silence. Caleb finally let go of the podium. "Fine," he said, almost spitting the word. "You want to crucify me for trying to survive? I did what I had to do. I had mouths to feed, a business to run." His voice grew louder, more defensive. "You think truth pays the bills? You think honor signs the checks?" But the room didn't echo with support. No one nodded. No one clapped. The silence answered louder than words ever could. Then Mateo stepped toward Sierra and gently took her reins. "Honor doesn't pay the bills," he said, calmly. "But it lets you sleep at night. And it lets your children look you in the eye." He turned to Elijah. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope to earn your trust." Elijah didn't respond, but he didn't pull away either. And sometimes, the first step toward healing is simply not walking away. The next morning, the barn stood quieter than it had the night before. The dust had settled, but the weight of truth still hung in the air like smoke after a long burn. Sierra was no longer standing in the auction pen. She was outside, grazing under the early light, free for the first time in years. Inside, Elijah Veyrón sat alone on a bench, head bowed, fingers tracing the edge of a worn photo he'd carried in his wallet since he was 15, a blurry picture of a horse and a man he used to wonder about. Mateo Carraldes approached slowly, not wanting to intrude, but knowing he had to. "That picture," he said softly, "was taken the day Sierra first let you ride her. You were 7. Elijah didn't look up. "I used to stare at it and imagine a different story. One where you didn't leave. One where I knew who I was." Mateo sat beside him, the wooden bench creaking beneath the weight of 2 decades of silence. "I never wanted to leave," Mateo said. "But after the fire, after the threats, I was told staying would put you in danger." His voice cracked. "So I made the mistake of thinking distance would protect you. But it didn't. It just broke us." Elijah finally looked at him, eyes tired. "You should have fought harder." The words weren't angry. They were honest. Mateo nodded, accepting the wound. Elsewhere in town, Isabella Lascora was already typing the first draft of the article that would change everything. Land fraud. Cover-ups. The Carraldes fire. Caleb Montoya's empire built on ashes. She had facts now, and names. But part of her hesitated. Not because Caleb didn't deserve it. He did. But because stories like this didn't just destroy one man. They revealed how many had looked the other way. At her kitchen table, Sofia Ardanza stared at a box of old letters Mateo had written her. Never sent, but kept safe by his sister who had passed years ago. Beside her, Marisol Tenoya read silently, heartbreaking for a love that never got a second chance. "Some truths come too late," Sofia whispered. "But it doesn't mean they shouldn't be told." Back at the barn, Elijah stood. He looked at Mateo for a long moment. "We can't erase what happened," he said. "But maybe we can write something better from here." Mateo blinked hard, fighting emotion. "If you'll let me try, I will." Elijah reached into his coat and pulled out Sierra's original halter, worn, cracked, and engraved with her name. He handed it to his father. "Then let's start by giving her back her name." A week had passed since the truth broke open like a dam. The town hadn't fully recovered, but it had begun to shift. Caleb Montoya had resigned from the auction house. His office stood empty now, the walls bare, save por velho chapo pendurado number prego enferrujado. No apology came from him, no final statement. Just silence. The kind that comes from a man finally realizing his name would never carry the same weight again. Mateo Carraldes spent his mornings brushing Sierra in the open fields near Sofia Ardanza's property. Her coat was fuller now, her steps steadier. The red wrap was gone, and in its place, a scar that told its own story. He didn't hide it. He never would again. Marisol Tenoya often watched him from the porch, quietly noting how gentle he became when near the mare, as if the horse grounded him in a way nothing else could. Elijah Veyrón didn't move back in with his father, but he didn't move away either. He stayed in town, working with local youth at the stables, teaching them to care for horses the way he had once been taught. Slowly, carefully, he and Mateo began rebuilding what time had shattered. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that was more than either of them thought they'd ever have. Isabella Lascora's article made national rounds. The story of a fire, a stolen legacy, a broken father-son bond, and a mare named Sierra touched hearts far beyond the dusty roads of their small Texas town. But more important than headlines were the quiet conversations it sparked, between neighbors, between generations, between truth and denial. People started asking questions again, and listening to the answers. On a warm Sunday afternoon, the community gathered not for a sale, but for something simpler. Mateo had invited everyone to the barn, not to bid, not to watch, but to witness. With Sofia beside him and Elijah across from him, he walked Sierra through the same auction ring where everything had nearly been lost. But this time, no gavel fell. No price was shouted. He simply placed a hand on Sierra's neck and said, "She's not for sale." She never was. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. What they offered instead was something far more powerful: silence, respect, and stillness. And as Elijah stepped forward, placing a gentle hand over his father's, Sierra let out one long, steady breath, like she, too, had been waiting for this moment. In a world where so much could be taken, this, at least, had been returned.